Hi, Steve Olson here with the Peak Group. I wanted to share a few thoughts today on something that our team gets asked about regularly. Because in residential real estate ownership, I think even in commercial real estate ownership, there's a dirty word out there, and it's more like an acronym, and that's HOA. We've all lived in one. We've all got the annoying letter from the busybody HOA president. I believe the term these days is a Karen. I don't know if I get in trouble for saying that, but they have a very, very negative connotation. But when it comes to build for rent communities, they're a very necessary component. And how they operate when you've got multiple people owning properties within that same subdivision is really important. Because you can think about it a few different ways. A couple episodes ago, I talked about the different ways to invest in real estate, and one of those was through what's called a syndication. And that's when you buy into a partnership, and for our purposes here, let's say they go buy an apartment complex, or they go buy a townhome community or something like that. That has its pros and cons, as we outlined. One of those pros is that because there's one manager and it's one partnership that controls the whole community, they can do what they want. The con is liquidity, and you're kind of at the mercy of that manager for how well they run the project. So if we kind of flip that around and say, let's take this build for rent community, and we have one in Hueytown, Alabama right now that's, I believe, close to 30 single family homes. And different investors are going to own all those homes. You might have one investor buy two or three of them, for example, but you get the idea. They're owned by different people. So there has to be one sheriff in town. There has to be somebody enforcing rules so that tenants can't just do whatever they want. Because if this owner over here has lax standards and they're going to let their people park on the lawn and not mow it and let the roof just look tacky, what does that do to the owner across the street when it's time for them to lease their property? Those tenants show up, they look across the street. This is kind of gross. You're gonna run off the good tenants. You're gonna bring in bad tenants. So you can see there has to be a uniform set of rules over the top of the whole community, hopefully without creating that HOA that we all have kind of come to hate, that is intrusive in our lives and so on and so forth. So that's what we're thinking about when we do an HOA for a build for rent community. We've noticed a couple of things over the years getting into this, and some of you are going to love this. Some of you are going to use it to fall asleep tonight because it's going to be like so detailed. But we've got to consider, what does the HOA do and what does it not do, right? Oftentimes on pro formas, putting an HOA in is just moving expenses from column A to column B. They're going to do a lot of the same things. So traditionally, like if we're doing, especially townhomes, the HOA is going to be covering the water, the sewer, the trash, all of the common area maintenance outside, walls out of the property. If there's a clubhouse, if there's a pool, they're going to cover those. They're going to cover all of the landscaping. They're going to cover snow removal where applicable. They're typically going to cover the administration of whatever smart home features. And that's something that's being increasingly demanded by tenants, is a smart door lock and various things like that. Most importantly in your analysis, they're going to cover the master insurance policy. So when units are attached, especially, you have to have insurance over the top, because you can't guarantee, or you can't leave the chance that the owner next to you doesn't have insurance, right? If that fourplex or that eightplex catches on fire and the guy next to you didn't have insurance, that's a problem. And additionally, the HOA is typically going to cover all of the exterior maintenance of the property down to the roof. And so these HOA budgets have reserves, and they have a variety of other things in them that allow that community to stay healthy. And if you don't run the HOA properly, the sales become a problem down the road. Less so in what I'm describing, which is a PUD, a planned urban development setup. They get to be really problematic when it's a condo project. And we've heard those horror stories of people in, for example, Florida, where the budget is bad and they had to do a gigantic special assessment and dues go through the ceiling. I own a fourplex in Houston right now that's been clobbered by insurance right? Another little trick, and what we're trying to do a lot more is master insurance policies are very, very expensive right now, especially in the Gulf and California with natural disasters. Premiums have skyrocketed to the point where a lot of carriers have moved out of some of these markets. And now sometimes you can't get insurance. It's a really big problem, and it has become prohibitively expensive in many cases because they look at that concentrated risk. And so one little hack that we've been using is if you can get your density the way that you need to in a build to rent community, is we make all of the properties, and we're talking duplexes, triplexes, and quads here, or sometimes commercial flex space. But if you can have each property be freestanding, right? So instead of 8 townhomes in a row that you plat as 2 fourplexes, right? You just do a fully detached fourplex, because then you don't have to necessarily get a master insurance policy. You can have that owner go get their own insurance because they touch no other structures. And then they have some flexibility on how to engineer that policy with deductibles and what's covered and what's not covered. And additionally, it allows you to move those HOA dues way, way down because, when it comes to master policies, they're expensive and their availability is limited. But when it's a single policy for a duplex or something, you've got a lot of carriers out there that'll do something like that. It's a lot more competitive. So we've been trying to do that more at the Peak Group to give that flexibility. And then you can get your HOA dues down to, 30 or $50 a month, because all the HOA is doing in that instance is taking care of whatever very limited common area there is, right? And then enforcing those CC&Rs so that if somebody across the street from you isn't taking care of their property, the HOA actually has some teeth to enforce that. And the idea is other than the landscaping maturing and, the properties age a little bit, you can go to that community in 5 or 10 years and it still looks really good. Whereas if you left that in the hands of a bunch of owners to decide on, you don't know how it's going to look in 5, 10, 15 years. So that's something that we really try to keep in mind. And I warned you about, a lot of granular details too. One of the things that really matters about HOA is what are your common area amenities? We've noticed over the years that clubhouses and pools and fancy amenities in a build-to-rent community, those are really helpful on your initial lease up. They're nice, but they do tend to be kind of a battle for maintenance and costs. It's one more thing that the HOA has to maintain. So you've really got to get to a minimum level of units before the economies of scale pay off. You would never do a clubhouse and a pool for 50 units. Unless there was just some crazy great margin and crazy great cash flow and the city required it on something like that. But when you start getting north of 100 units, it can make a little bit more sense to do that. So we've noticed that helps, especially on initial lease up. But it helps much more over the long term. When that tenant is sitting there thinking about, do I want to move? And they have nowhere to put their garbage, right? They go to the garbage and there's the dumpster and it's everywhere, and somebody threw an old mattress. That's gross. And that's hard on leasing too. So whenever we can get individual cans at the units, we go for that. Something psychologically happens, right? When there's a dumpster, people lose their mind. They have no pride of ownership and they just toss garbage in the general direction of the dumpster. But when it's their garbage can, it's mine, right? We just got our dog back from being gone at training for like 6 months. He's a French bulldog and they're really stupid, but he is a different dog now. And when he's in that crate, that's his territory and he keeps it clean. Sometimes us people, we are not a lot better than dogs. And when you give them that can, they watch that territory more. Your community looks way, way better. The costs of sending extra pickups for trash and all the hassle that happens at the HOA, they go way, way down. So garbage. And the second one is parking. If we can ever get more parking, I've noticed that cities oftentimes will say, we're going to require 1.5 or 2 spots per unit. Let me stress this. Just because the city requires it doesn't mean that it's right. Oftentimes, you need that extra parking because when people are living there and people come to visit and there's nowhere to park, they're going to be thinking about that when it's time for renewal. I don't want to pay much more, or I want to leave altogether and go somewhere where there's more parking. So that's the kind of stuff that they deal with on a daily basis, much more than is there a pool, right? So really important things to think about on the HOA level. What does your HOA do? What does it not do? Is that correctly reflected in your pro formas? How is it set up? How does it interface with the insurance? Whether you invest in a property with a P group or not, something I would strongly encourage you to do is take that master HOA policy to your insurance agent, because most of the time you're also going to need to get what's called an HO6 policy. Some people call it a condo policy, and that's what insures from the walls in. And you have to make sure that that HO6 policy interfaces with the HOA's master policy, so there aren't huge gaps and potentially not a nasty surprise if you have some kind of an insurance claim that nobody wants to pick up. So I told you we'd get a little bit granular, but these are things that really are worth thinking about, especially when you're going to invest in a build-to-rent new construction community. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.